When I think of waiting personally, the thing that comes to mind is amusement parks. I grew up in California and we had tons of amusement parks all over wherever I lived. Within an hour or two, you could be at some of the most world-class roller coasters. And I hated roller coasters as a young kid, but I grew to like them. And at some point I recognized that the waiting process in line with the roller coasters was an intention of the design. That the sense of snaking through, getting closer and closer to the action, seeing the car from far away at first and then getting close in and seeing how fast that movement is going, your heart begins to race. You begin to think about what it's going to be like to be on that ride. And as you get closer and closer, that anxiety builds and that anticipation builds and that excitement builds until you finally get to go on it. You might even be a bit nervous, and it builds up the experience of being on the ride itself. As I think about this in terms of waiting in Scripture, I think that it's not too different. Because I think as we see God intentionally putting waiting processes for His people in Scripture, we see that the waiting period is as important as any destination that they arrive to. That in the waiting itself, some sort of transformation is happening in their lives. And like a caterpillar inside of a cocoon, changing over time to emerge as a butterfly, that time period of waiting for the transformation and the transformation happening in the process of waiting is highlighted in Scripture. Think about the story of Israel, that here they are sitting in slavery in Egypt, and they are oppressed, and they cry out to God, and God hears their cries, and so He sends to them a leader who can lead them out of this oppression. And they get out of the slavery in Egypt, and God miraculously delivers them to the deserts of Sinai. And in that process, as they go over, they immediately begin to complain, showing that their hearts, though they were crying out to the Lord, weren't quite yet surrendered to God. And so God makes them wait 40 years to be exact. He causes them to wander around the desert until they begin to be the people who God needed them to be to follow His will and His direction into the promised land. This is a great metaphor for your life, for my life, that oftentimes when we find ourselves in patterns of waiting and when God is making us wait on something, that the real key there is God is doing something in us to transform us to become the kind of person we need to be to follow after what God's calling us to do in the end. And that transformation process is as important as anything else. And we have to trust that God is at work there in the midst of even that waiting time. That we're not just waiting for God to act at the end of the period, but that God is acting throughout the entire waiting process itself. God is moving our hearts, transforming us, and causing us to be people who are surrendered, who are humble, and who are willing to wait and abide in Him even through the most difficult of times. And so as we are here in our period of waiting in the world, we can begin to watch for the transformative work of the Spirit in our hearts, in our lives. Come back tomorrow and we'll continue our reflections on waiting.